Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Oroville Dam Citizens Advisory Commission. This is the 19th meeting of our commission, and it's great to be with everyone virtually this morning. We do some of our meetings in person and some of them virtually, just so we can maintain an effective. And so we're, of course, having this meeting virtually, and so we have commissioners present as well as members of the public. As usual, we'll have 2 hours for today's meeting, and we'll conclude by 12:30. As always, the meeting will be recorded and posted to the Commission's website, which is really important so people can kind of track our work. Our next meeting will be held in the summer and will be again virtual, and then we anticipate convening together in person up at Oroville this fall. To the meeting, we're going to have our colleague Tara Alpaugh from Kearns and West, who do a great job organizing us and keeping us moving forward. Tara's going to do a quick roll call of commissioners. So over to you, Tara.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. Good morning, everyone. When I call your name, please indicate if you are present. If you're stepping in for someone on my list, please state your name clearly for the record. So, California Natural Resources Agency, Secretary Crowfoot.
Here.
Assembly Member Gallagher's designee, Braden Pisani.
Yeah, Braden Pisani here on behalf of Assemblyman Gallagher.
Thank you. Senator Dolly's designee, Bruce Ross. Department of Water Resources, Director Namath's designee.
Tom Gibson here.
Thank you. Office of Emergency Services, Director Ward's designee, Deputy Director Njura.
Lori Njura here.
Thank you. Department of Parks and Recreation, Director Quintero's designee, District Superintendent Teague.
Here.
Thank you. California Highway Patrol, Commander's designee, Lieutenant Patrick Leach.
Here.
Thank you. City of Oroville, Mayor Pittman.
Present.
City of Oroville, Vice Mayor Smith.
Here.
Butte County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Conley.
Here.
Butte County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Kimmelshoe. Butte County Supervisors Appointee, Commissioner Bateman.
Okay.
Was that Commissioner Bateman? Was that someone else?
It's Supervisor Stevens from Sutter County.
Great. Thank you, Supervisor Stevens. Let's see. Sutter County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Boone. I know you were having trouble with your audio, so I am marking you as present.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Supervisor Boone is logged on and he can hear everything that you guys are saying. And our IT is in there with him now, just trying to get his microphone working.
Okay, great. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yuba County Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Furr. Yuba County Board of Supervisors Appointee, OES Manager Marin. Butte County Sheriff's Office, Lieutenant Beller.
Here.
Thank you. Sutter County Sheriff's Office, Deputy Lycan. Yuba County Sheriff's Office, Operations Captain Liebarger.
Here.
Thank you. Wonderful. We have reached a quorum of 13 commissioners. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone, again for joining. Thanks for all the work you're doing, including taking roll. I want to acknowledge several new commissioners that I believe are joining with us for the first time. Lieutenant Patrick Leach of the California Highway Patrol Butte County Division, Supervisors Jeff Stevens and Jeff Boone of our Sutter County Board of Supervisors, and Operations Captain Nathan Liebarger from the Yuba County Sheriff's Office. We appreciate you joining this commission, given all that you're working on. And as this commission was it was established in state law, thanks to then Senator Nielsen and Assemblymember Gallagher. And it's all about ensuring that the state agencies, including Department of Water Resources and my agency, are maintaining focus on the safety of the Oroville Dam and Reservoir and making sure that the community and public safety leaders in the region are aware of what's happening. There's a really strong dialogue about what's happening at the reservoir and dam and how we're working to maintain safety there. This is all, of course, coming out of the 2017 emergency spillway operation. And I do feel proud that we've made this commission into a really clear and transparent place to unpack a lot of the issues and ongoing questions and concerns from folks in the community. So big thanks for your willingness to join. And once again, thank our legislative colleagues represented here today, both for establishing this commission and then helping lead this. Today, we're going to continue several conversations that we started at the December meeting via our agenda topics today. These topics reflect specifically requests that were made and input from both commissioners and members of the public. And it's been really important through these 19 meetings to make sure that the things that we're talking about are actually relevant and so we keep a tracker of all the topics and suggestions and commitments made in these meetings and then update that over time. That's available on the website. So a lot of what we'll talk about today that we started talking about in December is really the origin of that is many of you saying, hey, we need to talk about this. We're going to first receive just a short update describing the process to update, or I should say, issue our second triannual legislative report for this commission. So when the legislation was set up, it established the commission and then required us to report every 3 years to the legislature. We did that 3 years ago, and now we're coming up on that again as we come into the 6th year of this commission. And it's important that we have a process that the commissioners feel like is open and everybody can provide input on that report about our activities. Then we're going to turn to the status of the city of Oroville's levy, and a major priority that the mayor and the supervisors have raised. And Mike Bassett of the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency will provide an update on a potential levy assessment, as well as funding opportunities to strengthen the levy, ensure its safety. As a related aside, I just want to acknowledge the important role of the commission flagging these local concerns. So this topic of the Oroville levy is one that we've heard about through this meeting, and DWR asked the Army Corps to include it in their one-time levy screening program. And so this is a good example of state, federal, local collaboration. We want to see of it. We want to see more of it. Our last presentation is going to return to the topic of the update of the water control manual. And many of us know what this is, but for those who don't, it's essentially the rules that govern how the reservoir and dam are operated. The Army Corps has control of the operations of the dam to protect our communities and our lands from flood. And that water control manual is decades old, and it really identifies, when to release water, how much water capacity, how much water space to leave in the reservoir, et cetera. And Army Corps is in the process of updating that manual. And so we heard in December, there's a period for what's called a scoping period, where the Army Corps is going to identify what the update is going to cover. And that's a public scoping period. So it's an opportunity for leaders, members of the community to figure in on that. And so in advance of the public scoping period, the opportunity to provide input, we've asked Jenny Fromm from the Army Corps to provide the commission a little bit of a 101 on the water control manual to help us understand just what goes into it and what could go into the update. And so of our commissioners and then members of the public to really engage in this public scoping period in an informed way. And then as always, our meeting's going to end with public comment, which is important to let folks who are tracking our work share their input. Before we dive into presentations, I want to turn things over to our colleague at DWR. I believe that's Tom Gibson, who's the Chief Lead Deputy Director on behalf of Director to make a few remarks. I always give Carla or her team an opportunity to do this because DWR is obviously so important in managing these facilities. So let me turn it over to, I believe, Tom.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. I'm happy to be here on behalf of Director Namath and say a few words before we kick off the presentations today. I do first want to thank our external partners from Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency, the City of Oroville, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for doing these presentations and sharing their expertise with us today. And then for an Oroville operational update, we're going to hear from the State Water Project's Deputy Director, John Yarbrough. So I will turn it over to him now. John?
Well, good morning, commissioners, and thank you. Good to be here with you all again today. Wanted to just share a quick update on Oroville operations. And so this year we've continued to see this pattern that we've seen over the last several years of some really dry months punctuated by some really wet months. So this year, October and January were really dry, and November and February were both pretty wet. And then December actually was about average. So that's more of our unusual condition these days. The February storms brought in some pretty significant inflows into Lake Oroville, and at one point we saw inflows just over 100,000 CFS. So that's quite a bit of inflow coming into the lake. Going into those storms, the Lake Oroville was about 75% full. So that's low enough that we were below the flood reservation space. But even so, at the end of January, as we're looking at the forecast, we're seeing these potential for large inflows. We coordinated with the Army Corps to actually start making releases early ahead of these storms to provide some extra space for flows into the lake. And so as the storms came in, we did start using the gated spillway back at the beginning of February on the 3rd. And we ended up making peak releases out of Oroville at about 35,000 CFS with 23,000 going over the spillway. The rest we're making through the Hyatt plant. Now that those storms have passed, we're continuing to make releases out of Oroville as we're bringing the lake down out of the flood reservation space. So if you go up there, you'll still see some flows over the spillway. We're using a combination of the spillway and Hyatt to bring that lake down a little bit. Right now, we're about 85% full, 85% of capacity. And so as we're doing that, we're continuing to look at forecasts and look at what's coming up and working with the Army Corps to adjust those releases based on what we see as we look out in the forecast. And so thought this example of our recent operations here at Oroville is a good backdrop for this presentation that we're going to get that the Secretary mentioned from the Army Corps on this water control manual. And as the Secretary mentioned, this is the document that guides those flood control operations. And so we're really looking for using this manual update to continue this, what we did here at this last storm of using some forecast, that information to inform how we're operating the reservoir. And so this manual update, an opportunity to really get the best available data and science that we have in our forecasts and then turning that into operations. So anyhow, that's my quick overview of some recent Oroville operations. And with that, we'll turn it back to you, Tom.
Thanks, John. And one part of what John was just speaking about that I really want to highlight is our desire to always use the best science and data available to enhance our water operations for the State Water Project. And in that regard, we are excited that we will have Marty Ralph from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography to present the final viability assessment report for Yuba Feather forecast-informed reservoir operations this summer, as well as having the National Weather Service California Nevada River Forecast Center come to present on storm forecasts and inflow projections into reservoirs for this summer's meeting. These two presentations will highlight the importance of using advanced forecasting in our reservoir operations to ensure the continued safety of downstream communities as our climate continues to toggle between these weather extremes that we've been seeing. So thank you again, and back to you, Secretary Crowfoot.
Thanks, Tom and John, for that. And John, I appreciate the update this winter and the operations. Before I move on, I just want to see if there are any commissioners that have questions for you about how the facilities are being operated this winter or conditions. And people can just, commissioners could just, if you wanted to talk, you could either raise your hand or just take yourself off mute. All right, then I think I'm going to move on and turn it over to auctioneers to offer any updates for the group. It's always a good opportunity to just keep each other informed of different things that are happening. No pressure to provide any updates, but want to make sure anybody who would like to can provide an update. And you can do so, again, raising your hand or just taking yourself off mute. Okay, Lieutenant Beller.
Yeah, this isn't really an update. I just wanted to mention how much I appreciate DWR's communication through the storms. Jack Miller did a great job of letting us know what the flows were looking like so that we could notify the folks that like to camp along the edges of those waterways and on some of the islands well in advance before they increase those flows to where it would have got dangerous. We really appreciate that communication, and I just want to let you guys know that. It really helps us out operationally.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
John, great. That's great, and and thanks, Lieutenant, for sharing that. That's one thing that we try to do with this commission is improve the communications, and so there's that electronic newsletter that's going out that I find pretty helpful. I click on that when it lands in my inbox, and then even more important is the updates to the public safety organizations around reservoir changes when these storms come in. So that's good to hear. Mr. Marin. Oscar?
We see that you're off mute, but we're not hearing you.
Shoot. We're not able to hear you. We're going to go to Lori, our colleague from Cal OES next, and come back to you and see if we can hear you then. Over to you, Lori.
Thank you, Secretary. I just wanted to mention that, or remind folks, Cal OES reviews emergency action plans from dam owners, and that includes the Oroville EAP. And it was one of our, I think it was our first EAP approved back in 2018. We just did a re-review and a reapproval. There were new higher resolution maps, inundation maps included, and then some of the other major changes that were made to the EAP were FERC and Caltrans were added to the planning process. The outreach documentation page was added to the plan. Representation of responsibilities was added for various fire, OES, and law agencies downstream. Notification flow charts were updated to reflect that. Plan holder representation was added to reflect those further downstream public safety agencies. And then, of course, the updated inundation maps and CAS added to the plan. So I just wanted to let folks know that we did reapprove that, and that is available.
Lori, that's helpful, and I'll make sure that or Tara, I'd ask you to make sure in the notes we provide a hyperlink to that emergency action plan. I guess to a member of the community, if I'm getting that acronym right. Sorry,
Secretary. It is, for official use only document. So it's not publicly available because it does contain private contact information in it.
it's helpful to understand. How would you describe the emergency action plan for somebody who's not in government that's aware of all of these acronyms? Like, what does it help us do?
Basically, it sets forth the preparedness activities that the dam owner is engaged in, and the planning activities, including those with both the local public safety agencies as well as downstream agencies. It also includes notification for various dam emergencies, contact information for those notifications. It includes preparedness activities such as, what kind of mutual aid they will need, and then any MOUs that they have in place ahead of time to get that aid. It talks about dam owner responsibilities, public safety responsibilities, various state and federal agency responsibilities with regard to the dam preparedness and response. So it's
So it's sort of a playbook
Oroville's
for,
is
it's
thick.
kind of a playbook. I'm always just trying to break it down in words that, you know, non-governmental people can understand. So it's kind of a playbook for, you know, what happens in emergency and how do the key public agencies and safety agencies communicate, et cetera.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. That's helpful. I would just say any government entities that are on here, if you don't feel like you're having access to that or you want a briefing from OES, I know they'd welcome that. Over to you, Mayor Pittman.
Hello, Secretary Crowfoot. How are you today?
Hanging in there. How are you doing?
Well, I just wanted to reemphasize the local communication to the downstream folks like the city of Oroville. Those text messages on the river releases coming out of the Oroville Dam are extremely helpful beyond just the notification of people along the riverbed, but to our sewer and sanitation folks that discharge into the river. It all has a combined effect, and it actually was well proven on that Tuesday night when we had a supercell hit our town. And that supercell dumped so much water that it overwhelmed our drainage system. And actually, we're just recovering some major repairs on different parts of town. But it was extremely helpful to have that heads up knowing so we could deal with all the other problems. So I just want to reemphasize that text communication coming from your folks is a huge advantage to what we have. In fact, that night, we had water coming in the city council chambers during our council meeting. It was flooding so much. So we had everybody running around the place, and it was a very busy night.
Well, thank you for everything you do to keep people safe in that. And if you have other suggestions around ways that, you know, we're not communicating or DWR could communicate that it's not currently doing, let us know, because it's good to know that the communication is strong and we're always looking to make it stronger. Over to you, Supervisor Connolly.
I'd like to back up the mayor. I heard from our staff at the county that communication was much improved, including in the Office of Emergency Services. I'd like to point out that Oroville does not have an emergency flood plan. The county is going to spend about $105,000 to start working on a flood plan. And when we later talk about the levy, we'd probably be looking to you or DWR to help make a more complete plan, especially if we can't get the levy improved. That's a little shot right there, but thank you. Overall, thank you.
Thanks, Supervisor Connolly, for the county's leadership in that. And you know, there's a good presentation or discussion on that, or ways that the state can figure in and be helpful to that Oroville flood plan that's coming together. All right, then let's move on. Before we get into the presentations, Tara, you're going to give a quick update on this action tracker, which again is a really helpful like accountability mechanism for us to ensure that like what we're talking about, state agencies and others are actually following up on. So over to you.
Yeah, in terms of the action item tracker, just as a reminder, we update that after every meeting and it's posted on the commission's website. We document what we heard as action items during the meeting and send them out to commissioners so that you all can verify that it matches your understanding. So please do look for those emails from Sam Arthur, because we want to make sure that the tracker is reflecting what we think the commitments were made in each of these meetings. And we're really working to try to work our way through all those agenda topics for future meetings and agendas. So, and make sure we get to the ones that are at the top of your priority list. I'm also going to talk real briefly about the second Oroville Dam Citizens Advisory Commission report, which we'll be drafting this year. This is going to cover content from commission meetings starting in fall 2022 through the end of this year. And so I'm just going to talk briefly about the drafting process and the timeline. Go to the next slide, James. As a reminder, the first commission report was published back in January 2023 and covered the first 3 years of commission meetings, so starting in 2019 and going through mid-2022. The legislation that created this commission, Senate Bill 955, required that the commission publish a report every 3 years that covers these three have on the slide here: an overview of ongoing maintenance and improvements made at the dam and its site, a register of communications received from the department and other parties to the commission, notice of upcoming plans made by the department for the dam and its site, and an overview of flood management projects on the Feather River affecting public safety and flood risk reduction. I realize I said 3 areas, but that is definitely 4 areas. So the report will cover all 4 of those areas. Next slide. So here's just as a reminder, this is what the final product looked like. Kearns on West staff does the drafting, but we received for that first report direction from first a small group of commissioners who provided input between commission meetings to help guide us. And then from the full commission via progress reports like this one at each commission meeting. And then also from written comments submitted by members of the public on the draft report. We really appreciated the effort of the commissioners and staff who provided that extra level of input between meetings. And for our last report, those were Senator Nielsen's chief of staff, Rob Olmsted, Butte Supervisor Conley, and Butte County Sheriff's Department Lieutenant Collins. In a moment, I'll speak to our plans for a similar process and feedback loop for this year's report. We can go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, this is a screenshot of the website. For those who are interested in revisiting the first report, you can see it's linked where there's that red circle there. So you can take a look at what goes in there. We can go to the next slide. So this report will cover the 10 meetings that have occurred since that last report, so fall 2022 through fall of this year. The report essentially pulls the content from OCAC meeting presentations and summaries into something that's kind of digestible in terms of a body of your work. And then the report will be shared with commissioners for feedback at both the outline and the draft report stages. And we'll also utilize a commissioner input subgroup for feedback and to ensure the report is meeting that legislative intent. So next slide. So you can see here we've depicted our plan for developing the second commission report. As you can see, there's several steps in the process. Currently, we're at that milestone on the far left in Q1 2025, introducing the report drafting process and timeline. We're aiming to finalize the report by the end of this year or early 2026. Above the blue arrow are the points at which we'll check in and ask for feedback from the full commission. And below the blue arrow are the points at which we'll get input from that commissioner input subgroup, which will include representation from both the senator and assemblyman's offices to ensure we're meeting that legislative intent. We'll first draft and socialize an outline of the report in Q2 of this year, and then we'll draft and circulate a draft section, followed by a full draft report in Q3. And it will be provided to all of you and to the public for comment before being revised and finalized. So we're looking forward to sharing all of the commission's important work and discussions over the past 3 years in this report. And I really appreciate the opportunity to update you.
Thanks, Tara. And for those who are new, it sounds like a lot of process to create a simple legislative report, but the goal here with this whole commission effort is to make sure this isn't just a check the box exercise, that the commission is actually really meaningful ensure that the state and federal agencies are taking care of the facilities, addressing safety concerns, and then, the work is meaningful, and the way we report it to the legislature is meaningful. So the idea is, like, rather than just having DWR write something and send it off, and we want some eyeballs of commissioners just to make sure this reflects what you believe the commission has done over the last few years. So big thanks on that. Questions for Tara about the committee report or commission report that we're developing? Tracker?
I have one. This is Supervisor Conley, just briefly. Are we going to include FERC in that report so FERC knows what we're doing?
In other words, like sharing the information, sharing the report up with them?
Yeah. It might even be great if they recognized us and, understood the good we're doing.
Yeah, it's a good suggestion, Supervisor Connolly. So let's add to the action tracker from this meeting. One, making very clear that they, understand and receive this report, but then two, kind of strengthening, their participation and engagement. I do know the Army Corps is participating in today's meeting, so they're listening in on this as well. So we can ask them about that too. All right, good. Then let's move on and really get into the here. As I mentioned earlier, concerns, questions about the integrity of the Oroville levee has been raised at several commission meetings over the past year. As I think most of us know, but it's important to point out, the Oroville levee is a city-owned levee, so it's not under the oversight of the Army Corps or the state, but it is part of this broader flood control system that includes Oroville Dam that protects the communities of the region. The system includes a variety of components that are regulated at different levels: local level, state level, federal. So it's really important to understand how these fit together and how we can support each other in the efforts to maintain the levee. It's in the best of all our interests, because of course, the folks who are protected by this levee are not only citizens of Oroville, but they're Californians, they're Americans. So we're all focused on supporting the efforts to ensure the levee does its job. And so we're thankful and, as always, excited to have Mike Sabufka, the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency, who's going to level up our understanding of the history of the Oroville levee, as well as the efforts underway, the joint efforts to evaluate relative risk compared to other levees, and then any potential remediation needs. And big thanks to Brian Ring, who's also joining. He's Oroville City Administrator, and he can help answer questions that come up in this discussion. So over to you, Mike.
All right. Well, thank you, and good morning, Secretary Crowfoot and members of the commission. My name is Michael Bassett. I'm the Executive Director for Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency. And like the commissioner said, like Secretary Crowfoot said, Brian Ring is here with me today, the City Administrator, to answer any questions at the end of this presentation. And I apologize in advance. I've been battling a cold all week, so I may start coughing a little bit, but I'll try to get through it and not bother everybody. Next slide, please. So today we want to provide an update to the commission on the status of the City of Oroville levee integrity concerns, kind of what we've been doing for the past over 2 years now since we've really raised this issue to the commission. Highlight potential impacts if the levee is not repaired or improved in a timely manner. Items to consider: how do we make progress on improving this public safety concern? So we'll talk about that. And then lastly, and most importantly, the good news today is that we'll be launching into Army Corps levee safety inspection. And at a subsequent presentation today, Eric James with the Corps, he's going to get into more details of these levee safety inspections. So I'm going to quickly go through my slides, but Eric's going to provide a lot more detail. But we're very happy to be able to report today that we'll be launching on this inspection. And then lastly, we'll turn it over for questions and comments. Next slide, please. City of Oroville levee integrity and interior drainage concerns. So we've highlighted the fact that this levee that is owned mostly by the city. We've been working with the city to bring up real estate information, like who has underlying fee title to beneath the levee, and we're pulling all that information together. The city's doing all that work. Most of the properties are owned by the city, but some are owned by the county, and some are privately owned. So we're pulling all that information together. But ultimately, the city is responsible for this levee. And it has a history of seepage and boils. So it does not perform well during high water events. The levee in question is a little over a mile. It's about 1.1 miles long that we're talking about. And as the secretary highlighted, it's not part of the state plan of flood control, nor is it part of the Army Corps' program. So it's kind of lingering out there. And we're trying to figure out what's the best steps forward to understand the safety risks and make the appropriate remediations to that levee. The slide here shows the FEMA floodplain map that they have out there, and it shows in orange the areas that would be inundated at a 100-year event. Now, we've done some recent floodplain modeling, and we believe when FEMA actually comes in to do a remapping of the city, that this floodplain will get larger. So, and the city also, as brought up by the mayor earlier today, has interior drainage issues. So when the river gets high, the city, which drains by gravity, once the river is high enough to impact that drainage, the city will inundate. So the city on their own, they're looking to do an interior drainage study, and they're looking for grant funding to advance that effort as well. So not only levee improvements are needed, but interior drainage improvements are needed for the city. Next slide, please. The potential impacts of doing nothing is obviously a public safety concern is the first situation. Evacuation concerns, you have Highway 70 right there that the Feather River is just adjacent to. So we're very concerned about that. Secondarily is the FEMA coming in and doing a remapping effort. So what does that mean? So if they remap the city, they'll identify what that floodplain is, the special flood hazard area. Those properties within that area will have mandatory flood insurance. Any development that would want to occur in that area would need to be built above the base flood elevation. We've been coordinating with FEMA Region 9 to get a better understanding of when they might be engaging with the city, and it's not real clear right now, and it's definitely more unclear as a result of the new administration in DC. But we're keeping our tab on it because we're working with FEMA on floodplain remapping in Sutter County right now. So we have close connections to Eric Simmons in Region 9. So once we know more, we'll be able to convey that information to the city. But ultimately, they will be doing a remapping of the city. So we're trying to get ahead of that. There's also the potential, we're not quite sure yet. We need to do a little bit more research because the area that's protected by this levee protects less than 10,000 people. Even though the city is an urban area, the entire city isn't protected by that levee. So we're not exactly sure if SB 5 is applicable, but there is a potential that it could be. So we would need to evaluate that as we launch into design efforts in the future. Next slide, please. So items to consider to make progress. And I kind of want to highlight what we've been doing over the past year or so. We're working with the city to identify local funding sources. So there's going to be a cost share, a local cost share needed for whatever program that we're able to find or secure some sort of grant funding. So we're trying to identify if the city has a cost share that they could come up with. Keeping in mind they're a severely disadvantaged community, so their budget is not in a good situation. So that's why we've been closely coordinating with DWR to try to identify some funding to advance the project. The city has also stepped up. Brian Ring, the city administrator, has been working closely with our team and with DWR to advance this work. He has staff that's been on point also to assist. So this is like a new thing for the city. As we've discussed in the past, they never realized they were in charge of that levy or responsible for it. So this is something brand new, and they're still trying to get a grip on it. But the good news is they did engage with SBUFCA, Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency. We entered into a services agreement to provide our expertise, because this is what we do, levee improvements. We pretty much focus on flood risk reduction work. So if we can offer those services to the city, which we are doing, we think it's a good win-win situation. So we entered into that agreement, I believe, earlier in 24. We also, we've been spending some time with the HDR engineering study, that was concluded in 2015. And we provided that information to the Army Corps in advance of their upcoming levee investigation. So that will really help ramp up their effort to better understand what the situation is. We're also, we're continuing to pursue any sort of state funding opportunities, federal funding opportunities. We recently met with Senator Megan Daly in her office and, talked through this situation and answered her questions. And I believe she's going to be putting in for a budget request to assist the city to advance this project. So whatever support we can get from the department or the commission to get some funding, just some seed funding to advance some work would be greatly appreciated. Next slide, please. So here's where we come into the National Levee Safety Program. So this is the one thing that we've successfully landed so far. And I really want to thank Mike Merswa with Department of Water Resources. Mike made this all happen. So as we've been coordinating on the city of Oroville levee issue, Mike brought up the fact that, hey, they have these national levee safety one-time inspection programs. Let's apply. He reached out to his contact. I mean, we were on the phone the next day or within a day or two, and we brought in Brian Ring, and then the Army Corps accepted it. So, and now we're moving forward. So it's been a real good, positive situation, and we're grateful for it. And I'm not going to get into a lot of details on the National Levee Safety Program. Next slide, please. But we are looking forward to working with the Army Corps to better understand, using the Army Corps' levee safety guidelines to evaluate the situation within the Oroville levee and come up with information to better classify the situation at hand with that levee. How would it perform under different hydraulic conditions, and what sort of remediation is necessary to make those to make it much safer for the public. Next slide, please. What I like about this slide, this shows the levee systems throughout the Army Corps. I mean, throughout the Army Corps, throughout the United States. And if you look at California and then in the Central Valley, you could just see, there's a lot of levee systems here in California that are in the National Levee Database, and there's a lot that are outside of it also. And obviously, this city of Oroville levee is not currently listed. Next slide, please. So here we go. We one-time levee review. So we, like I said, we've sent over information that HDR developed in 2015, the report that was funded by DWR. So that information is being utilized by the Army Corps right now, so that when they get boots on the ground, they'll be much better educated on the conditions of that levee. And we've set up a site inspection. So it's going to be a 2-day effort where it's a physical site inspection and in-office work where we go over the findings and come up with basically a report card. The screening risk assessments are flood loading, so hydraulics, hydrology we'll be evaluating, levee performance, and then what are the consequences of levee breaches and overtopping. Next slide, please. So this is an example of a recent Army Corps one-time levee inspection that was completed along the Kern River. And they performed the inspection in November of 23, and they had the report finalized like 3 months later in February of 24, which is great. So we're looking forward for that type of turnaround. And basically it'll make all the recommendations of what the findings are, what the next steps should be. We'll have a much better, and put some cost estimates to that also. So we'll have a much better understanding from a core lens of how they evaluate that levy and what they recommend moving forward. Next slide, please. So next steps. So data is needed, and we're going to get a lot of data from the Army Corps' inspection, but we also need to do geotechnical borings and analysis. That's really the next step that needs to occur in my mind. And I'll be working with the Army Corps on this evaluation, but we need to understand what those geotechnical properties are and run those through an analysis by geotechnical engineers through seepage modeling to get a much better understanding. The one-time levy screening is happening in May of this year. So, a couple of months away. So we're excited for that. The city's going to be bringing in their entire team of experts. We're also looking to see if we can identify some experts that may have retired, and we'll be working with Mayor Pittman on that to get, the knowledge of people who aren't currently working for the city, but who have that city knowledge to maybe offer that up. And we could, really benefit from that. So we'll be working on that in advance of our May 7th meeting. And then once we get the report card, then we can figure out, we'll meet and we'll decide what are the next steps. And then obviously we'll share those results with the commission, and DWR, Mike Merzwa and his team will be at that levy screening also. So we'll all be working together, three-legged stool here with the Corps and the department and Sabufka, and four-legged in the city. So yeah, it'll be good. So we're looking forward to that. And then lastly, we did apply. So there's another opportunity out there. So the city applied to the Army Corps Section 165 Continuing Authorities Program. And that would provide a much more robust feasibility study if they're accepted into that program. I just recently checked in with the project manager from the Army Corps, and they're waiting on a budget to be passed by the federal government. So they don't know what sort of funding they're going to have for this program. So things are on hold right now, unfortunately. But we're hopeful, and we sent in a lot of support letters, and that would be a really opportune follow-up to this one-time levy screening. So it would really dovetail and flow right into a more robust feasibility study. But we will need some match money. So that is another request that we would be looking for, either through the Senator Dolly or directed funding from the department. So we'll need some sort of match money as if we're successful in being accepted into that program. So that's my update today. And I know Eric James is going to give much more details on this levy safety program, but I'll stop there. And I really appreciate your time today. And I didn't cough too much, so I'm happy about that. And I'll turn it back to you, Secretary Crowfoot. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much. That was a really good presentation for a lot of us who are not sure this priority or the specific levy ins and outs and the facts closely. And I think to me, the key takeaway is that we have to work together to do more assessment and get more information and data actually on the levy and its vulnerability, so action can be taken. I want to call on Supervisor Stevens, who had his hand up first, and then over to Mayor Pittman.
Hey, I'll ask Mike about this question, or anybody who knows actually. Is this water coming down from the dam, the Feather River, or is this a off stream?
No, coming from the dam.
And it's really never been looked at before, and it's just in the city of Oroville. That's amazing.
Very unique situation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor. Over to the mayor.
Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot. A little perspective. The Oroville levee that was put there was a 4-inch concrete slab poured back in 1913 with literally horse-drawn carts and hand mixing operations. One of the things that you'll find if you go into the basements of the old buildings in downtown Montgomery Street, if you go to the basement, you'll actually see a storefront. an actual storefront that would have, you know, a front door and everything. And what happened is over the years, so many floods occurred, they got tired of digging it out. So they said, forget first floor. We moved the first floor up to second floor. And many of the buildings that have been around a long time are actually operating as a first floor on the second floor because the floods damaged downtown so much they got tired of digging it out. So it is a very unique situation, and consequently, that's why the city built that. And it's just a 4-inch slab laid on the slope of the building or the levee itself. So, and you can imagine the concrete mixed back in 1913. I doubt the components were very high quality. The other component that happens, and of course, the drainage issue, as we mentioned, I appreciate Michael's presentation entirely. He's got a good picture on it. But the other factor that happens in addition to it, inside that levee happens to be a very critical communication link, a fiber optic cable that serves the West Coast. And it actually is on top of and in the levee itself. So we're going to not only protect the citizens of Oroville, but also that critical infrastructure that uses the levee for the underground transportation of that communication cable. So I appreciate this look at by this committee, and look at this. We have kind of a missing link in the system that we all advocated, and my forefathers advocated for the Oroville Dam. And I remember in the 50s, they were successful in getting $60 million from the federal government as a contribution to the Oroville Dam for flood control, which was the main reason to have the Oroville Dam for the Oroville community and others downstream. So we appreciate this attention, and we appreciate anyone's suggested efforts in this whole process, because it's critical to the whole network. And I would much rather see an improvement to the levee to maintain the necessary flows to help regulate the flood pool for the Oroville Dam. And I'd hate to say that, you know, because the levee is in such condition, we'd have to regulate a certain flow below so that we could maintain the integrity of the levee. And that's not our goal, but I would hope that our goal would be to be able to maximize the river channel to help with managing any and all flows necessary to help with the flood pool on the Oroville Dam. So again, I appreciate the attention, and we'll be talking more. And it's a very good thing. We have some wonderful staff and city engineers that are working on this topic, and we look forward to the future conversations. Thank you all.
Yeah, big thanks, Mayor, for raising this as an issue and concern. And I hear you in terms of the levee being strong enough and dependable enough to really enable the full flood flows down the river. And of course, you know, priority 1A is protecting the folks behind Oroville. Let's turn to Supervisor Boone.
Thank you. I have a question regarding Michael Bissett there at Center Butte Flood Control. He posted a map of the national database of all those levees. Now, are those levees owned by the state? Are they owned by the national government? Who are they owned by? The federal government?
Supervisor, great question. And maybe Michael, you can put up that map again. I don't know if it's easy to do, just so we're all looking at the same thing.
Yeah, my understanding is those are levies that are within the National Levy Database.
Okay.
So the Corps has information on those levies.
Okay, so if they're on the national database, are they funded and maintained by the federal government, or a partial, like 65% and 35% state? I mean, how do they split that up between the state and the national government, federal government?
And Michael, would you like me to take that one?
Yeah, yeah, please.
Okay. So it's a mix of all those things, I can say. These are every levy that we know about in the Corps. These are, I mean, I guess it could depend on what filter was run when that map was printed, but every levy that we're aware of, even some that maybe are not considered a levy, maybe a highway in some cases acting like a levy, those are all these dots. And for the ones in the Mississippi River, many of those are owned and operated by the Corps. The ones in California are primarily owned and operated by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board as a local sponsor to us. So Mississippi Valley is a different animal, but the other places, they're locally owned by the state or the local agency.
Okay, so my question was, who pays for the maintenance? I know when Folsom is building on to their dam, and it's my understanding that the national government or the federal government pays 65% to maintain it, and 35% is from the state. So I'm just wondering, are these all in California on a 65-35% basis, or is it on a each levy by itself, how it's maintained?
So for operational costs, it's 100% borne by the local sponsors. For instance, the levees downstream of Folsom, American River Flood Control District maintains those levees. They pay for them, the maintenance. The 65-35 is a construction cost split. So the federal government bears 2/3 of the cost. The locals 1/3, usually share between the true local agency and then the board at the state level. So that's a construction cost. But once in California, they're 100% locally operated and maintain all the costs of that.
Okay, so recently we've been here in the Sutter County area with the Sutter Butte Flood Control. We put a wall, a barrier down the center of the levees. So you're saying that those are 2/3 because it's construction. 2/3 was paid by the national government.
Yeah, Michael could probably answer that one better than I could. But generally,
I'm a new supervisor. I got lots of questions, so I'm going to ask questions as I see needed.
Yeah, it's similar to what Eric said, Supervisor. So the capital improvements are typically cost shared 65% federal, 35% non-federal. All the maintenance costs are by the properties that benefit from those levies, so the locals. And that's pretty much how it works. Ours program was a little bit different because we advanced it with just the state and Sabufka ahead of the Corps at the time, before the Corps passed or approved their feasibility study and it was appropriated. So it's a little bit more complicated, and I can go over that with you offline.
Sure. I appreciate your time. I just trying to get some numbers here based on where the money's going and trying to figure it all out. And it's like you said, it's pretty complicated. Depending on where you're headed, and you get different answers from different people. But ultimately, we're back to the 65-35, and then locals basically are in charge of maintenance.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Supervisor, those are good questions. And I confess that I find it super complicated, and I've been in this role for 6 years. So here's more quickly than I have. Just kind of joking about that. But I would say, let me put Eric, I can put you on the spot a little bit. First of all, huge thanks. Eric's the Chief of Levee Safety for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he's on to give us a little bit of the 101 on the water control manual. But appreciate your expertise into this conversation. So wanted to ask Eric on the Army Corps, and maybe, I don't know who the right person from Department of Water Resources is, but Michael, interested in you. What are the key takeaways in terms of state, federal support and partnership on this levy? We recognize it's a local responsibility levy, but we all want to lean in on trying to be helpful, I think.
Yeah, I think Michael made a great point. He made a lot of great points. I hadn't heard about the CAP project. I think that's one way. The Continuing Authorities project is a way to get the Corps to fund a feasibility study and perhaps construction as well. I'm not a CAP expert, so I can't speak to that, but I know we've done that in other rural communities. Like Battle Mountain, Nevada is another one I can think of, and then some in the Southern Central Valley. So yeah, that Continuing Authorities program. There's other authorities from the Corps that can be used. The floodplain mapping assistance, that's basically the state asks, or the locals ask us for help. We can behave like a consultant and provide technical advice. Yeah, those are the two major avenues. I think Michael mentioned another one that's in my mind right now.
Thank you. I see that Laura Hollander, who's the chief of flood at DWR, is joining maybe by phone. So I don't know if it's Laura or John. Just want to get, or Tom, just get your perspective on how DWR can figure in.
Laura Hollander, our deputy director, is on. So Laura, let me hand to you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Laura Hollander, I think. Oh, there I am. Yes, the state has been and will continue to be actively involved in helping to find funding pathways. And as discussed earlier, Mike was instrumental in helping with the core in this National Levee Safety Database program. Also, I know as mentioned earlier that the city is interested in doing some flood planning. We have a lot of expertise and we can provide technical assistance in that regard as well. So happy to be a partner however we can.
Laura, that's really helpful. I see Supervisor Connolly, Supervisor Boone, your hand's still up, but that might be an artifact of.
My hand's up.
Okay, so why don't you continue, finish up on your questions, then we'll turn to Supervisor Connolly.
Right. I had one other quick question for Eric, and that was the California aqueducts. I'm getting a little further downstream. Who maintains the aqueducts for the water that's shipped down to the San Joaquin growers and then on further down to the LA Metropolitan Water District?
I think the state would have to answer that question. I don't have any knowledge. Sorry.
Great question, John.
Yes, Supervisor, the Department of Water Resources is responsible for operating and maintaining those, and so the funding of that, we collect that revenue from the beneficiaries of that water. So those water users, those growers, those cities, they're funding DWR through the long-term contracts, and then we use that funding to operate and maintain that infrastructure.
The state pays for it then. The state maintains it.
No.
It's actually it's the state water project, which sounds a little confusing because it sounds state funded, but it's actually funded by the water agencies and irrigation districts that benefit from the water. So that's the state water project. And then there's the federal water project, which is the federal infrastructure, which does include some of the aqueducts as well on the federal side, which is funded by the federal contractors, cities and mostly irrigation districts that benefit from that water. Is that fair, John?
That's accurate, Secretary.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Supervisor Connolly.
Thank you for such an open and transparent meeting. I think that we've come a long way since the very first meeting. And
I'm sorry, Supervisor Connolly, you do seem a bit quiet. Could you just pump it up a little bit? Thank you, sir.
all right, I'll pump it up a little bit. I talk pretty loud. Two issues with the levee. One, it was created just like the mayor said, and it was seasonal flows and it protected the town. But now it is actually used, if you think about it, to transport water. I mean, we have to have the levee in good condition. Otherwise, it's just logical that the Army Corps' manual is going to have to call for larger flood pool in the river, in the lake. Think about it. If they can't flow 100,000 to 150,000 cubic feet per second because it's going to flood the town continuously, then that means the flood control manual is obviously going to have, just logically, is going to have more space in it. Then there's less water delivery. So I'm trying to put forward a case that the state should take on a lot of the responsibility for the repair and upkeep of a levee that's mainly being used by the state to transport water. And I'll let you think on that. I don't need a response.
I appreciate that. And I certainly heard what you said before your mic was up, and you appreciate the transparency. So I guess I just want to make sure DWR and Army Corps hear that. And Supervisor Connolly, I think the argument you're making is it was originally constructed over 100 years ago, as Mayor Pittman said, served a very different purpose. This was well before the Lake Oroville and the dam, and that I think your argument is that the levee has to serve a very different purpose these days. And in order for that, flood control infrastructure, aka the reservoir and the dam, to fulfill its potential and to really work effectively, a stronger levee is needed, and therefore it's really not simple local responsibility. Is that more or less your argument?
Yes, and it's also to benefit 27 million people, and how many farmers benefit from the water downstream. I mean, we're willing to, locally, we just want to be safe, right? We're after flood control. We have plenty of water up here. So I think it's logical if they want water delivery, then they need to work with us to make that levee very, very safe. And that way you can use it the way you intend to use it in the old water control manual with flows up to, I saw projected up to 200,000, which we know would have flooded downtown. But why would we want you to have to bring it clear down to say under 100,000 no matter what? That means you would have to keep a larger pool, less water to deliver later to keep us safe. And I've heard from you and others that your priority is our safety. So yes, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And so it seems like so I just wanted to make sure that you could emphasize your point. And see, it seems like we've got a good set of next steps, which is to really get the work done to assess the vulnerability and what's specifically needed. I appreciate and heard Laura, the chief, flood chief at DWR, saying they want to, help figure in and support that planning, with technical expertise, et cetera. And Eric, appreciate you jumping into the conversation, even though you're brought in on for another item. So a good next step. And Michael, I'd invite you and also supervisors, Mayor Pittman, we can bring up this topic in a subsequent meeting too, to check in on our progress, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sounds real good. I want to move on just to keep us on time, if that works. So I'm going to move us on to item number 4, which is all about this water control manual, specifically kind of a 101. We're really entering an important point of time with this public scoping period. And so I think Jennifer from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and Eric from the Army Corps, who just talked, is going to give us the sort of the overview of the water control manual. And if you can, in your presentation, anticipate some questions that often get raised, but has also specifically been raised in the context of this commission. Over to you.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you, first of all, for having me again to present to you. Today, we're going to be talking about water control manuals, and this is kind of a water control manual 101. So next slide, please. I'm going to go through what we're going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to start off with the Corps' authority for flood control operations. Then we're going to talk about water control manual overview, different types of updates. Then I'm going to go into specifics about the current water control manual that we have for Oroville Dam at the moment, and then walk through the water control manual update process. So next slide, please. So the Corps gets our authority for management of the flood control space through Section 7 of the Flood Control Act of 1944. And that Section 7 states that the Corps shall prescribe the rules and regulations in the interest of flood control, and the project owner is responsible for real-time implementation of the water control plan. But the Corps has the authority to determine the flood releases in the flood control space with input from the owner. We often call these projects that are owned and operated by others Section 7 projects, and it's because of the Section 7 of the Flood Control Act of 1944. Oroville is a Section 7 project. Next slide, please. So starting off with some big picture stuff regarding Corps' water management. So basic objectives: operate to the authorized purposes and laws that each project has. And sometimes when I say project, I mean the dam, and I will try to make a cognizant effort of saying dam, but I might not. It's old habit. We maintain the structural and operational integrity, avoid risks to public health and safety, life, and property. So the Corps is responsible for the water control management at all Corps projects, but we also have responsibility at those Section 7 projects that I just described, including some navigation regulations, special acts of Congress, taking into account FERC conditions and other agreements. Next slide. So what is a water control manual? So I'm going to start off with first, like, what a water control manual is not. A water control manual does not contain the information about anything except for minimum flows regarding the conservation space. So if you're looking to the water control manual to give you insight on how the water users use the dam, that's not going to be in here. But what is a water control manual? It's a guiding document that specifies how the Corps is going to operate the reservoir for the flood control space. Oh, real quick too, before I keep going, I've had a couple of technical issues this morning, but they have seemed to resolve themselves within about 30 seconds or so. So if I do disappear, I should be back in approximately 30 seconds, and just let me know like what the last thing you heard. Okay, continuing. It provides operational instructions to personnel involving the management of the reservoir, including emergency situations, prevents the loss of institutional knowledge, and ensures an unbiased operation so that the mission's priorities are transparent to the public. Sometimes, depending on the manual itself or the district, these are called reservoir regulation manuals. And they have Appendix A, which will have standing instructions to the dam operators. They'll have the water control diagram, and they'll also have an additional diagram called the emergency spillway release diagram, which basically tells you how to operate the gates if you have a gated spillway. And I'll go into more detail about those specific diagrams later today. All right, next slide. Okay, so some water control manual terminology. It can get a little confusing because a lot of them start with water control and then there's a third word. So here we have a water control manual, which we just talked about. It has a description and history of the project, any information on the water control plan, which is the operations for flood control. So within the water control plan, there's also a graphical description of that water control plan, and we call that a water control diagram. And that will show you like the flood control space that's needed for every single day, the release requirements, and anything else regarding flood control in a graphical way. And we're going to walk through that today too. Next slide, please. Okay, so before we get into the details about specifics of water control manuals, I just want to highlight like anytime we're updating water control manuals, we're looking at the Corps' regulations when we do that. Here's a list of them. I'm not going to list them by name. I did highlight the third one, which is preparation of water control manuals. And that essentially shows you the literal template on what we need to put into a water control manual. So it recently got updated in 2018. So Oroville and New Lords Bar, when we update these in a couple of years, they're going to be the first ones, at least at Sacramento District, where they are using the new template. Next slide, please. So within the water control manual, there's multiple chapters, and the main purpose, as we talked about before, is showing you the day-to-day operations on how we operate for the flood control space. We have an introduction, description of the project, the history of the project, any watershed characteristics, how we collect data and communicate with the project itself, and also the project owner, if that's not the Corps, any hydrologic forecast information, the water control plan, the effect of the water control plan, and then water control management. I've highlighted the water control plan, which is chapter 7, because that's where essentially the meat and the potatoes are. Like that's where we're looking to do our day-to-day operations for flood control. Next slide, please. So within the water control plan, we talked about that graphical representation of the plan, and we call that a water control diagram. You will often hear that referenced as a rule curve. I tend to just use water control diagram, but if you hear rule curve, that is also referencing water control diagram. Next slide. So now I'm going to kind of break it down and kind of simply help you understand like how like the real world with the reservoir correlates to essentially two pieces of paper, because that's what the water control diagram and the emergency spillway release diagram are. So here you'll see, just not to scale, a simplified picture of a reservoir. You have the outlet at the bottom, you have the conservation space at the bottom of the pool, you have the flood control pool in the middle, you have gross pool at the top, and then the maximum surcharge for the dam safety at the very top, the top of the dam. And then I did add some additional references to specifically for Oroville. On here, we have the emergency spillway crest and the flood control outlet spillway crest, which is also the spillway. Next slide, please. So how that correlates to essentially a piece of paper, you'll see the water control diagram is in the green. Typically, a lot of the diagrams you'll see in California will have a trapezoidal shape, where in the fall, you'll have the drawdown period. In the winter, you'll have a period where you need the maximum flood control space. And then the springtime, you'll start the refill period. I've also referenced the 750,000 acre feet that Oroville's flood control space has on here too. And then you'll also see the pink space, which is showing where the emergency spillway release diagram has control. You'll notice that like you can operate those gates before you hit gross pool. And that's often the case with a lot of spillway gates on specific dams, but it's not often the case. Like sometimes you don't operate the spillway gates until you get to gross pool. It just depends on the project. For Oroville, you can operate the gates before you hit gross pool, and that diagram shows you how to do that. So next slide, please. So next we're going to walk through the water control diagram itself. So I have a couple of animations here just to kind of show you like there's different sections of the diagram, and then we're going to dive in a little deeper to each of those sections. So next slide, please. So here we have the water control diagram itself. Next, please. Then we have the water control diagram rules, and then next, please. And then we have the release schedule. And then there's one more on here. Next slide. So in 2024, DWR updated their area capacity table. So DWR incorporated that new area capacity table into their operations the beginning of their fiscal year, July of 2024. At the core, we took that same information, but incorporated that into our system in the beginning of our fiscal year, which is October 1, 2024. So these are just notes on the diagram that we have right now saying we did this and what that looks like. Next slide, please. So now we're going to look specifically about the water control diagram. And it is kind of hard to read because we didn't zoom in that far. So let's start with like what we're actually looking at. So we're looking at on the y-axis on the left-hand side is the flood control reservation in thousands of acre feet. On the right-hand side, it's the same information, but in elevation. And then on the x-axis, you have dates, starting in September, going all the way through June. And then you'll see that trapezoidal shape that we talked about earlier. And you'll also see there's multiple trapezoids. So what is that? That is the wetness parameter. So we're going to go into details on what that means here in a second. But essentially, what the wetness parameter does is it takes a look at the gauges within the watershed and determines like if it's rained a lot, how much flood space do you need? If it's rained a lot and the water and the ground is saturated, if it rains again, most of that water is going to end up in the reservoir because the ground is already saturated. There's no room for more saturation into the ground. And so you're going to need more flood space. So as you see, like the beginning, like in the middle, it says 3.5 inches or less. And at the very bottom, it says 11 inches or greater. So as the watershed gets more saturated and we get more information from those gauges, in order to determine how saturated the watershed is, we're going to need more flood space. If it has not rained a lot and the ground is not saturated, because that's what it means if it hasn't rained a lot, then if it rains again, most of that water, it will end up in the ground, but some of it will end up in the reservoir. So you don't need as much flood space if it hasn't rained a lot and the ground is dry. So that's what the wetness parameter is trying to help tell you. How much flood space do you need on that given day? And at the core, we do this calculation every single day. So if you go to the next slide, I'll show you a graphical representation of that in a minute. So if you go to the next slide, there's two rules here. Oh yeah, here we go. Perfect. Okay. So this is the plots we show on our public website. And at the very top, and this is water year 23. So water year starts in October 1st, goes all the way to September 30th. So water year 23 started October 1st, 2022, and went all the way through September 30th, 2023. That's also correlates to the federal government's fiscal year. So it works out really well. So at the top, you'll see precipitation. And so you'll see those blue bars that will come down showing the precipitation. This is only the precipitation at the dam itself from that specific gauge. When we're looking at the wetness parameter, we're looking at 8 gauges throughout the watershed, in order to determine how wet or dry the watershed is. Then in the second section, you'll see there's gross pool with that blue line that goes across. Then you'll see a gray shaded section. That's the conservation space. So that's when DWR has control of the reservoir. when the blue line, which is the actual storage on that given day, when the blue line is in the gray space, DWR has control of the reservoir during that time. If the blue line goes into the white space in between the gray space and gross pool, that's when we're in flood control operations. So the Corps talking to DWR, we're looking at what releases we need to do, and then we're making decisions on what that is. And then at the bottom, you're going to see inflow and outflow. And inflow is in green and outflow is in orange. And this is a daily plot. We also have the hourly plot on our website too. But I wanted to show you this because you'll see how the gray line kind of goes up and down. And that's because the calculation through the wetness parameter is done every single day. And so every single day we have to look and see how much flood space do we need on any given day, and then make our analysis from there. So if we go back a slide, probably should have put these in a different order, my apologies. So this is when we're looking at the rules of the diagram. So the first rule is dealing with how the wetness parameter gets calculated. So I talked to you about how we're looking at 8 gauges that throughout the watershed. And so today, when we're doing the calculation, we're taking yesterday's number, we're multiplying it by 0.97. So we're taking 97% of that, and then adding the current day's precipitation in inches. So that way we'll get that daily data for today. And the reason we multiply it by 0.97 is because that's accounting for some 3% of losses that happened yesterday. The second rule is talking about the maximum releases and also how fast or slow we can increase or decrease releases when we're in the flood space. So if you look at A, B, C, D, and E, I'm going to walk through those. Like A just says, like, here's the release schedule. B just says, make sure that the maximum flows in the Feather River above Yuba River do not exceed 180,000 CFS. C says the flows in the Feather River below Yuba River do not exceed 300,000 CFS. D says that flows in the Feather River below Bear River do not exceed 320,000 CFS insofar as possible. And then E tells us how fast we can increase or decrease releases. Releases are not to be increased more than 10,000 CFS or decreased more than 5,000 CFS in a 2-hour period. Now, and that doesn't mean this is a maximum when you're dealing with all 3 of these. Like the max at B, C, D, and E, that's all taken into account. With E, that's the maximum we can increase or decrease releases. It doesn't mean we have to do that maximum. And in a lot of cases, we do not do that maximum depending on the situation. So it could be that we're increasing 2,000 CFS an hour, and that is within the bounds of this rule, and then we're decreasing 5,000 CFS in that 2-hour period, and then that is within the bounds of the rule. Next slide, please. So we already looked at this. And so I also wanted to show you like where you can go on our public website to figure out what the wetness parameter value is for any given day. So I have the link at the bottom here. If you go to daily reports, this is within it's called the flood control report. So you'll see like FCR. And if you have questions about finding it, just let me know. This is last year on March 7th, 2024. I circled the number. Last year, March 7th, 2024, the wetness parameter was 9.75 inches. So we needed a little bit. It rained a decent amount at that point, not the full 11 inches where you're needing the full flood space, but it was getting close to 10. So if you have any questions about what the wetness parameter is on any given day, you can go to our public website and take a look at that. And sometimes that won't get calculated until 10 o'clock in the morning. It's because we're waiting on the data from all 8 gauges. Next slide. All right. Then we have the release schedule. So this is kind of walking through, when you have any given inflow or forecasted inflow, and then how much flood space you're using will determine the release requirements. So next slide, please. So I'm not going to walk through the specifics of how it looks like on the water control diagram. My team made this graphical representation that shows you the same information. I personally like this better, but that's just me. I'm more visual. So this is a graph of the release schedule that my team made. So the y-axis is showing how encroached you are on any given day, and that's in acre feet. And then the x-axis is showing you the actual or forecasted 24-hour inflow in thousands of CFS. So if you're in between 0 and 15,000 CFS, I'm looking at the first section, and you're in between 0 and 5,000 CFS encroached. I should have put some dots on here to make my point a little better, so I apologize for that. You would only be releasing power through the power plant. But I'm going to go to the third section. If you are seeing an inflow of 75,000 CFS and you're 15,000 CFS, 15,000 acre feet encroached, then you're going to be releasing the lesser of the maximum inflow, or 60,000 CFS. So this is telling you, based on how encroached you are in the flood space and the inflows you're currently seeing in the last 24 hours or forecasted to be seen in the next 24 hours, what your release actually is. Next slide. And then we also have the emergency spillway release diagram. I'm not going to go through the details of this because it's a whole different level of complication. If y'all want me to do that in the future, I am available to do that. But I did just want to show you what we're looking at here. So there's some animation on here too, like I did with water control diagram. There's the ESRD itself, the graphical representation on how to operate those gates. And then the next two animations, we got the rules on how that works. And then we also have some notes as the next step. Next slide. So now we're going to talk through how and why we update water control manuals. We're going to start with the why. So water control manual update justifications. We have two types of updates. We have an administrative update where we're updating the points of contact. We're updating any activity that's occurred within the watershed since the last time it's been updated. We're updating to any core standards. We talked earlier about a new template that we have for the water control manual. So we update to those new standards. And then we also update the hydrology. So the last time that Oroville and New Bullards Bar were updated was in the 70s. And so we're updating the hydrology. I mean, you know, for any update that we do. But we're not doing an administrative update for Oroville and New Bullards Bar. We're doing a comprehensive update where we're looking at revisions to the water control plan. So we're doing everything that we do in the administrative update, including updating the hydrology, but then we're also looking at revisions to the water control plan. Next slide, please. So here is a flow chart on what all the things we look at when we're updating a water control manual. And I'm not going to go through this, but I'm going to kind of walk through it more simplified here in a second. But the bottom line is there's a lot of things that are going on. So next slide, please. And ultimately at the end of the day, how we're updating the water control manuals is by looking at our policies when it comes to NEPA. And I've listed some of these here. Any regulatory or permit actions that may or may not be applicable depending on the situation. And then the blue is showing the water control manual development and reviews. It lists 3 of the regulations that we use for that, but I also showed you some earlier today, more ERs that we look at when we're looking at updating the water control manuals. And potentially there's some ESA consultation that needs to occur as well. So we're looking at our policy every time we update the water control manuals. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to try to simplify it for you because anytime you look at a flow chart that you can't see all the words, it's a lot. So here's a simplified water control manual update process. So this has some animation to it as well. So first we start out with, it's typically a 4 to 5 year process. In this particular example, I'm showing a 5-year. It could vary, but that's the plan. It's not a 10-year process. It's a shorter process. So we start off with the next slide, project management plan. So that's telling us roles, schedules, responsibilities. Through that, we also develop a hydrologic engineering management plan, which basically defines what do we think we need to actually study and what tools do we need to use in order to do that. Next slide, please. Public outreach and stakeholder outreach is something that occurs throughout the entire process. Next slide, please. Updating the hydrology, we talked about that before. Oroville and New Bullards Bar water control manuals, the last time they were updated was the 1970s. So we're updating the hydrology through 2023. Next slide, please. We also have to model the existing conditions. And in a lot of cases, we already have that because we have a real-time model that we're using for flood control operations, but there might be some additional things that need to happen to ensure that it gets captured appropriately. So we're making sure that we model the existing conditions appropriately. And this helps us both from an engineering standpoint when we're looking at alternatives that where we may want to change something with the operations, and also helps with the NEPA analysis to see like where the effects occur if changes are made. Next slide, please. Then we're also looking at project alternative identification. So what potentially could be some changes in operations that, you know, we the Corps want to see, DWR wants to see in regards to New Bullers Bar, Yuba Water wants to see, or the public wants to see. So like what alternatives do we want to look at regarding changing those operations? Next slide, please. We're also looking at the environmental effects analysis. So any changes that gets made, we have to go through the NEPA process to ensure that we've done our due diligence to make sure that we're not making things worse than they were before. This also includes a cultural analysis. And so through the cultural analysis, the NEPA analysis, it potentially is an iterative process where we figure out what's the best operations giving what changes we want to see and any impacts that are occurring from a NEPA or cultural perspective. Next slide, please. Then there's also a bunch of reviews that need to happen. So we create an engineering report, and the water control manual will be an appendices to that engineering report. We plan to have an engineering report for Oroville, and then we also plan to have an engineering report for New Bullers Bar. There may be a lot of overlap because we have to do these projects together since they share a control point in Marysville. We're looking at the NEPA analysis and doing those reviews. I should have spelled out these acronyms, so I apologize. ATR stands for Agency Technical Review. And so that's where we're looking at other folks outside Sacramento district within other districts of the Corps, that they do the reviews to make sure that, you know, all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. IEPR, I forget what that stands for, I apologize, but essentially means like, then we also do some additional reviews with other agencies, making sure all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And then we also review the water control manual itself. Next slide, please. And then there's the final review and approval. So the ultimate signee for any water control manual update is the division commander. So that would be South Pacific Division Commander. At this point, that's Colonel Hondura. And so through that, like there needs to be policy reviews to make sure all the policy has been followed appropriately. The legal folks need to look at it to make sure all the legal things are in there, and then it gets approved by the division commander. Next slide, please. So the last thing I want to leave you with, besides my question slide and the ability to get in contact with me before, if you have any questions, is like, we're also working on a bunch of other water control manuals at the time within the district. And I've kind of broken these down into, you know, not necessarily the reason why, but just gives you an idea of like what updates we're doing. So for the first section, we have construction. There's construction at Schaefer. There's construction at Isabella, there's construction at Folsom. So those are being updated for construction reasons. In some cases, the operation's not changing at all. The only thing that's changing is the structure, but we still need an updated water control manual to go with that. In other cases, as in Schaefer, the capacity is changing. So we will need to update a water control manual that will show like the capacity has changed. An administrative update, Merced Stream Group, they are 4 dry dams where we do not have the ability to operate them. They have a gate that's fully opened at all times. And so you can't change operations when you're not actually changing the gate. So that's why that's an administrative update. The comprehensive updates we're working on, these are all core projects except for the Truckee, Black Butte, New Hogan, Hidden Terminus, Pine Flat, Buchanan, and the Truckee system. And then I put another little bullet here for the FURO pilot study for New Bullers Bar in Oroville. So that's what we're working on right now. Next slide, please. So here's just a way to get in contact with me and my team if you have any questions. There's a QR code if you want to scan that. There's also an email address at the bottom that goes to multiple people on my team, including myself. So if you have any questions, let me know. And if you want me to go into additional details in future meetings, also let me know. That is all I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. You covered a ton in a short amount of time. And I believe that this PowerPoint presentation will be available on our website, on the commission website, so that'll be helpful. I'm going to turn to Supervisor Boone in a moment, but can you just remind us of the public scoping plan period, and then if there are local leaders or community members that want to engage, how best to do that?
Yes. So the current plan is to start that scoping process in the spring. And granted, spring is, in a couple of weeks, but it might be towards the end, later in the spring. And then per the regulations, you will get at least 30 days notice before any of those meetings occur. And my plan is to also let the commission know, like, these meetings are occurring, so everyone's educated on when meetings are happening. And, if anybody has any questions about that, you can just let me know.
Super helpful. Supervisor Boone.
Supervisor Boone, you need to unmute yourself. You're currently still muted. Hold on a second, I'll prompt him to unmute himself. He's currently muted still.
I'm sorry, here I am talking and I didn't have my mic on. I apologize. Thank you, Jenny. We appreciate your time. Very informational. I'm a little new here, still trying to get up to speed. Who actually, who's in charge of the Oroville Dam, if you will? And do they permit, is DWR permitted to run that dam, or how does that all work?
So DWR owns and operates Oroville Dam. So when it comes to any operational changes, they're pushing the buttons. So even in the flood control, they're pushing the buttons and making the gate changes. They are overseeing through State Water Project, and please, DWR, step in and add more as needed. So they're doing the operations for the conservation space. When it comes to the flood control space, when the project gets encroached into the flood control space, that's when DWR and the Corps are talking, and we're having conversations about what the best release is going to be at the time. And then we're also coordinating with Yuba Water Agency at New Bullard's Bar, because since both these projects share a control point, we have to be in communication depending on what releases are happening at the time. After the 97 event, I'm going to give a little bit of history. A program got established called the Forecast Coordinated Operations Program, and that includes the National Weather Service, the Corps, DWR, Yuba Water Agency, and it really became like an avenue for us to communicate better as a team when it comes to operations and looking at the system operations, because that's essentially what you have to do when you're looking at higher flows from New Bullard's Bar and Oroville. So through that program, we have a really good line of communications set up. And I don't know if DWR wants to add to that. Over.
Okay,
I think that was how I would have described it. So thank you.
I have one question. So what does FERC, the acronym for FERC is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? Do they permit DWR, or is that a whole different thing? I mean, I'm hearing bits and pieces from different people.
It's a really good question. John, do you want to talk about the FERC relicensing?
That is a great question that I cannot answer. So
sure. And so I'd say, high level, there's a number of different agencies, source of regulations for Oroville Dam, and complex facilities, so a lot of different aspects. Because Oroville generates electricity through the Hyatt power plant, we then have to have a license for that activity that we get through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. They issue a hydropower license for our facility, and then through that process, we are regulated by that aspect of the federal government.
Okay, so they are permitted to a certain extent for the electrical portion, is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but that's a big deal, and that's a big deal too, because this relicensing process, which is a big, long, multi-year process, is we're underway on that too, and FERC ultimately can require certain things of the operation of the facilities. So you have Army Corps, federal authority on all things flood control, and then FERC, which gives us this big decadal license to operate the power. And John, do you want to just in a couple sentences explain where we're at on the FERC relicensing?
Yeah, so we have initially a 50-year license, and so that license 50 years ended back around, I think it was around 2009, and so since then we've been operating under an annual license that's extended by FERC. Because that license was expired, DWR went through a pretty extensive process with a number of different agencies to come up with an agreement, and that agreement, we call it the settlement agreement. That settlement agreement, all these different groups agree that those are the terms that FERC should put into a new license when they issue that. What's been, I think, noteworthy is that process was, quite a few years ago, and FERC has not yet issued that license. So that's where, from DWR standpoint, we've been wanting to really push on FERC to issue that new license. We've spent all this time agreeing to this package that we're looking forward to implement. So we need FERC to issue that license with the package so we can implement those activities. But
so
yeah,
basically they're on a temporary license right now.
Every year, our existing license terms, they are carried over year by year. So yeah, every year we operate on a continuation of our original license.
Do you know if there's any issues that occurred back in that time, and that's why they decided to issue a temporary license?
Yeah, that's their practice when they don't have the new terms of the license. They continue over the existing ones. There have been a number of, different things that happened. I think, one note, 2017, I think the spillway incident was one item that FERC wanted to wait and see how that played out. Still, that's been 8 years ago now. So at this point, I couldn't really tell you why we haven't seen a new license out of FERC. That has been an issue, nationwide. As you talk to dam owners, you'll hear that pretty constantly, that the length of that process of getting new licenses out of FERC is a pretty common experience, unfortunately.
So are other dams up and down the state on a temporary license as well, or just Oroville?
And so it'll be other dams that have that power component that brings in for the hydropower license. That's
right.
Not every dam. And yeah, the status of other dams, I know nationwide this is a common problem. What I don't have is the outside of the water project, other dams that are in a similar situation. That's one I don't have off the top of my head of that list.
I just wonder what it was that triggered the temporary license at that point in time, initially in 2000 and what'd you say, 9 or 7? I just wonder what that driving force was that changed.
If I may, Supervisor, I do think this has been fairly typical of FERC with a lot of, it's the decadal permits. And so when they're looking at a new permit, they're signing on for another 40 or 50 years, and they sort of pull in all the other regulatory agencies to provide the conditions that will be the basis for that license. And I think it's been a common experience that process takes longer than the expiration date of the original license. And so they go on the annual licenses as a holding pattern until the final action can be taken. So I don't think it was particular to Oroville by any stretch. I know the Klamath dams were in a similar position before, and I suspect if we had FERC on, they could run through a list of the other.
So my question is, it takes 20 years to get them to get a new license out? I mean, I'm
Believe it or not, I mean, it's a little bit hard to get your head around, but I've been in this role for 6 years, and for the entirety of the 6 years, we've been making the case for FERC to relicense. There's a lot of local benefits that are going to, including recreation benefits and improvements that are going to accrue when FERC relicenses, and everyone agrees what everybody's required to do. I think that, it's like regionally, we're all united on this. So this could be something that we push on. And let's, Tara, flag it for, a future meeting. I do want to give a time check, which is we have 15 more minutes in the meeting, and I want to make sure we have time for public comment. Supervisor, are we good? If I move to, okay, great. We're going to move to Vice Mayor Smith and then Mr. Bateman.
I appreciate the conversation regarding flood control. As you know, 2017, there was a lot of impacts from the spillway incident. In particular, there were many millions of dollars in damage to the Riverbend Park, which is operated by the Feather River Recreational District. And I was just in conversation just a while ago with the district, and going back to the 1.1 mile levee, which that park sits right at the end of that structure, there are some concerns about the current releases and also going to the gravel restoration project. As you're aware, the gravel restoration project is for the, of course, the salmon and the spawning habitat, and so many thousands of yards of gravel are being input into the river, which of course raises the base of the river right along that levee structure. So in talking to the district, what just occurred with this current release of up to, I think, 35,000 CFS is that all along the park, again, they've just incurred many thousands of dollars of damage. I said the amphitheater was inundated. They lost all the beach sand, all the footings to all the park benches were damaged, and their drainage system is full of sand. And so, with just that minimal amount of releases, which this is anecdotal, you know, I'm certainly not an engineer or expert, but it seems like that with the current releases, and I'm attributing it to perhaps that restorative project for the salmon, that as the bottom of the river comes up, it takes less water than to encroach into the Riverbend Park. And to that issue, the district just informed me that they were not notified. They had no opportunity to prepare the park for the current releases. And I know that other agencies were notified. So if that could get on the radar for the district manager, Feather River Parks District, and other folks over there to get whatever that looks like. It's an email list, but they certainly need to be on board with that. They said they were not informed until the sheriff's department was, of course, going along the river out there to let people that might be camping along there know about the current releases. But so when in May, when Army Corps, or when that look-see happens, it'd be I think just anecdotal information. There's some frustrations with the park district. There's some concerns about the restoration project as to how it might affect our levee and affect that park. So again, I'm just the bearer of information, but I think it is relevant to the conversation of flood control and its impacts on our community. Thank you.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. And Tara is going to include that in the action tracker, and we can figure out, if we need to add that to the agenda at a future meeting. Mr. Bateman.
Yes, I wouldn't like the impression to be given that there is no opposition to the relicensing. We've written after the 2017 incident, we wrote several papers to FERC, and we, as a result of a petition that was signed by 6,500 people, and some of those issues are unresolved, and there's not been any real effort to resolve them. ORAC, which is a creature of the old license and will be removed with the new license, withdrew. The community members withdrew from the settlement agreement, and the settlement agreement now has many of the people who signed on it 20 some years ago are no longer active and all participate much. And so I think it's unreasonable to think that there is general agreement that the new license should be issued with that settlement agreement as the operational one. Anyhow, that's one point. And the second point is on the water control manual. We've had some really constructive discussions with the DWR and the Corps, and we're waiting for the FARO final report before really deciding how to address the issue, particularly of the control of the reservoir. The levee situation, I think, has been developed rather well. But the control of the reservoir, there will be some issues which the downstream communities have a different view than others. And it would be very helpful if we could get a unified group to approach those issues. And we haven't had much support from downstream communities, and I would like to suggest that through probably Supervisor Connolly, the downstream communities do let us know that they want to be involved, and then we can look at the thing from one point of view and not have lots of different points of view being presented. Anyhow, that's what I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bateman. Two important points. I appreciate them. Supervisor Connolly.
I don't want to waste a lot of time here, but Butte County is not a signer to the relicensing agreement. We see the socioeconomic impacts that were brought to the community have never been fully addressed. The promises for recreation aren't even close to being addressed. We know we'll never achieve what was promised, but yeah, we're not a signer. The tribes aren't signing. And I would hope and wish in the future that it isn't an alternative relicensing process, which was very tainted by the way it was facilitated. It was facilitated in a way that the water contractors, i.e. DWR, would benefit much greater than the local community. And I would think that the relicensing should be reopened. That's my opinion. I've written to FERC about this, and anybody's interested in what was promised and not given, I have probably a 30-page synopsis I wrote up. It doesn't mean I'm mad at anybody at DWR personally or the Water Contractors, Inc., but I feel that it must be noted that if we're a federal facility, we'd probably get a share of power. We'd probably not have trouble, leasing our water. We'd probably have greater recreation. We might even have the sheriff running the facility in a way that people are invited to come back. So we're way away from signing any agreement, and that may be news to you, Mr. Crowfoot, but no, we're not close. And it's difficult to talk about here because it's not really on the agenda, but anybody wants to talk about reopening this or coming to some reasonable settlement, we are open to that, but no, we're not close. And I'll give you two examples. Our out-of-pocket expense above any revenue generated by this dam in our backyard is about $7 million a year now. And the $41,000 we don't receive payment in lieu of taxes, which we're a federal facility, there'd be another 7 million. So we're talking 14 million right off the top, let alone if you live through the social economic downturn after the dam was completed and the promises weren't fulfilled, you'd be a little more tainted like I am probably. That doesn't mean that we couldn't come to some reasonable resolutions in the future. Talking about FERC, they do issue licenses where the entire community agrees, people are taken care of. Tribes are given land, given access to land, power generated is shared with the local community first. They're kept safe. They have robust recreation. New York Power and Water comes to mind. Idaho Power comes to mind. So what I've been told, honestly told by attorneys from the other side of this is, we don't give you payment in lieu of taxes. We aren't going to address your socioeconomic impacts. We are not going to do any more recreation than required by FERC, even though it was promised before, because they never gotten a contract, because we don't have to. That is the basis of where our negotiations have been for all these past 17 years. And I'd like to see that change. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Connolly. Very, very helpful clarification. I appreciate it. It's important for me to hear that as well as others. I want to just check in and identify that we're at 12:25. And I know Eric James from the Army Corps had additional part of the presentation. I think it was on levee safety, or at least a lot of addressing levee safety. That's obviously an important topic for this group. I do want to get to public comment and also enable everybody to get onto the meetings that they have. I have a hard stop here at 12:30, but Tom Gibson from DWR can moderate through the public comment. Eric, I want to turn to you. Specific top points that you want to make sure to make in this conversation, or if we can roll over your presentation to the next meeting.
We could. I mean, I can go quickly and try to cover some of the questions that were asked that haven't really been answered. There were a few that I could try to tailor that to.
My goal would be not to have you walk through a long PowerPoint presentation, but certainly to be responsive to the questions that were raised.
Yeah. Okay. I can do that. It might help to use the PowerPoint to kind of quickly go through that, though.
Leave that to you. If people can, I know that we're going to lose a lot of commissioners, but why don't you go forward as you see fit?
All right, I'll go real quick here. Michael Bissett did a great job. So we can go on to the next slide. Michael Bissett did a great job covering introduction, so I don't need to go over a lot of this stuff. So here's what is shown in the NLD, the National Levee Database that Mike talked about. This is the inundation area that we have. You notice it's different than FEMA. This is using State Route 70 as a levee. State Route 70 is behaving like a levee based on the geographer that entered this data in. So this is very preliminary. When we do the risk assessment, which I'll talk about here in a second, we will update that inundation area, that blue area, to more accurately match the topography and the embankments that are out there that we know of. But yeah, that's why there's some discrepancies here. The link to the National Levee Database is on my presentation down here, that you can go to that link. It will take you to the public-facing version of the NLD. The local sponsors have access to the FOUO for information only part, but for the public, they can look at this. This link will take you there. Go on to the next slide, please. This is the public-facing aspect of the National Levee Database for that Butte County Oroville levee. You know, so it doesn't really have a name. The Corps has not updated this. A lot of the information here was just drawn from the existing national databases for population, census database, existing GIS databases. So this was sort of auto-populated. When the Corps, works on our study, we will refine this information. We generally don't touch these non-federal levies until we do. And then once we do, we go and update everything. So this eventually will reflect more accurate information here. Next slide, please. Mike already covered this part. We can we can skip this part. You go on to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit more about the detail here. I think about the team that goes out there. So we'll have a team of folks, range of experts in hydraulic engineering, geotechnical engineering, and economists that go out there and they'll look at this levee. They'll make visual inspection of the site. We don't call it an inspection that has specific meaning to us, but we're just calling it a site visit. They'll be looking for indications of its performance, and we'll combine that with the information we get from the city and other stakeholders in the area that have information on this embankment, as well as existing air photos and topography. So we'll take all that information and then we'll perform a risk assessment. So go on to the next slide. That risk assessment will determine the likelihood of breach for this levee, and that will be used to inform the community. So the community will have that information that will say, according to the loading that we had, and this kind of gets to the question earlier somebody asked. So our hydraulic engineers will look at the flood frequencies for this and combine that with the geotechnical risk and performance of the embankment, overtopping the embankment, and provide a comprehensive number that shows what's the likelihood of this levee breaching or being overtopped. And even though this is almost kind of like, it's better than a back of the envelope analysis, it's still a pretty good assessment. We're bringing in national experts that will do that. So you're talking about people who have national experience. We'll also have our local Sacramento people there. So we'll have people that know the soil conditions and the levees and dams in the region to kind of meld that along with our local sponsors' input to get a complete picture of the project. It's good to have boots on the ground that have been there. Like I know Oroville, I know the Feather River, And so, we want local input on this as well from the Corps and the local agencies. Next slide, please. Real briefly, we are embarking on another risk assessment. As this morning, we kicked it off on the West Feather River project. There was one done in 2016 after Sabufka did much of its work, but not all of its work. So this new risk assessment will capture work that Sabufka did after 2015 and that the Corps and Sabufka did together after 2015. And it will also importantly incorporate the Oroville incident that happened. Right now, that previous risk assessment was prior to 2017 or 2016 is when that was done, so it did not have any information. That includes the emergency evacuation, like lessons learned. That includes like issues that happened geotechnically to the embankment, erosion, some seepage and piping problems we had in the embankment. So we will look at everything that happened back then. Next slide, please. Kind of already covered this, but this new risk assessment will consider, basically, that's the bottom line, all the Oroville event and lessons learned from that. I can say right now the current risk assessment does not show a high risk of failure due to downstream erosion. And many of those areas were addressed by Cedar Butte, and we'll look at the true risk once we really evaluate that work that was done over the last 8 years or so that the Corps and Sabufka did. And that's going to change those risk numbers. But again, we're just kicking this up today, and we're excited to be able to include the lessons learned on those projects. And we will get input from the local sponsors on that as well. Let's see, next slide. I kind of already said that. We're already going to take into account all the lessons learned on Oroville. So the Central Valley Board is a local sponsor, as well as the agencies within Sabufka. So those folks will be invited to participate, and they're invited to bring their engineers as well. Next slide. Okay, so that was my last slide. So sorry. So we're looking for public input on those risk assessments, both of them. We'll get started on the first one in Oroville, the Oroville levee soon. This is going to be affected by the travel ban that we have right now. So the federal government, we cannot travel, only the military folks can. So it may be a wrinkle in that. So this just came down yesterday. So unfortunately that May date, I'm less confident of that. So we're going to try to work through that. There are exceptions to that policy. If there's life safety risks that are in play, we can get exceptions from the Secretary of Defense on those. So unfortunately, that's the kind of the bad news. That kind of throws a little bit of a cloud on that. So anyway, that's what I had. If there's any questions.
Thank you, Eric, for running through that. If there are no questions for Eric, and I appreciate your sort of racing through that, Eric, and your previous comments that were very helpful. Before we go to the public comments, we wanted to take a few minutes to mention first that we are continuing to address the topics that are on the action item tracker. In terms of the next meeting, we did talk about report out on the contents of the final FERO report and scripts here, and then the California Nevada River Forecast Center's inflow forecasting, state investments and snow runoff forecasting, and a legislative report update. Do any other commissioners have proposed topics for the summer meeting that they would like to add at this time? If not, I just want to say thanks to everybody for being so engaged and making sure we're using this forum effectively for commissioners and for the residents in the Oroville Dam region. And with that, let's open for public comment. If you would like to make a comment, please click on the raise hand button, and then we'll call on you in the order we see the hands come up.
Okay, there's one hand raised, Ron Stork. I'm gonna go ahead and allow you to speak. You should be
Thank
able
you,
to unmute
James.
yourself, Ron.
This will be quick. Ron Stork with Friends of the River. We're an intervener in the Oroville relicensing projects, and I was on the ad hoc report that committee that DWR had a few years back. Just some clarifications. FERC licenses all the project works, not just the hydro facilities. hydro facilities are what trigger a project to be jurisdictional, or at least it's one of the key elements. But all of the project works, spillways, hoists, all that become something that FERC licenses. And it is true that it's not uncommon for projects to go after their original license is expired, to go for years and not, and we've been involved in projects that have gone on for decades of annual licenses. FERC just doesn't seem to be able to license its projects very expeditiously. The Corps presentation was, I think, a nice summary of how a reservoir regulation manual works, or water control manual. But it did omit a rather important fact, which is that DWR, to its credit, is operating another flood control operation, which is within the Corps' operating minimums, but DWR's is attempting to enhance the flood control in the sense of not ever having to use the emergency spillway during the standard project flood, which was the original performance standard for Oroville Dam. So the rule curve goes deeper than the core rule curve. So good for DWR in that case. And of course, that may be revised with the manual update, and there will be choices made on how conservative the flood control operation will be going forward. But right now, DWR, to its credit, is operating more conservatively. That's all I had for you.
Great. Thank you, Ron, and thank you for the clarification on the scope of a FERC license once their jurisdiction is invoked. I appreciate being clear on that point. Any other public comments?
We have another hand raised from Matt Mendick.
Great.
Oops, sorry. Matt lowered his hand, raised his hand again, so give me a second. Matt, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Yeah, thank you. A lot covered today, running out of time, so I kind of reserve my right to submit questions to Jenny and DWR, but a quick one for Eric, since he's leading into the risk reassessments of the downstream levees. The ER regulation on levee design gets very deep into pore pressure, pore water pressure, and shear strength, and based upon different conditions. And I think it's extremely important that, as that regulation says, that each situation is evaluated for its uniqueness. One of the things that's unique about the downstream levees is going to be the loading conditions, the yo-yoing effect of maximum flows, having to pull those back for running out of release capacity, running them back up again, holding them there for 5 days, and then dropping them to zero within 48 hours, as noted in the fire roll preliminary viability report graph that we covered in the last meeting. And how you evaluate what the risk is to those, so you can communicate those risks to the local agencies that need to declare evacuation notices. It's estimated that when we evacuated in 2017, 180,000 people, and it was a short evacuation. I think they cleared it the second day, possibly third day, that it was, over $50 million hit, closer to 75 million or so, back of the napkin calculations for that 3-day evacuation to the local economies. And if not mistaken, there may have been a death associated with that as we evacuated the hospitals. So this spring, as you hopefully can get out here on your travel ban and inspect these things, would it be possible to inform local agencies a guideline on when evacuations should be declared? Is it, you know, at what level? Because the water control manual just seems to think about the downstream constraints as, you know, 300,000 cubic feet at Marysville, but we may be evacuating at 250 or something, and throwing us into these evacuation situations. So if Eric, if you could quickly speak to Army's guidance. I know a lot of it's boots on the grounds and the boils that we had, like by the 10th Street Bridge in 2017. But I'll stop there and let you answer that.
And thanks, Matt. Yeah, Eric, if you can, I want to be respectful of folks' time, knowing that we're over, but I also want to make sure we can get to a brief response for the public comment.
Yes, sir. I can, as far as the first question about fluctuating water levels, the risk assessment teams for both the Oroville levee and the West Feather River levee are going to want to look at that. They're aware of the issues after the dam incident, and they're going to want to look at that. So that will be a subject of their risk analysis. As for the second question about emergency action plans, those teams will look at the existing county emergency action plans, but we don't review the county's plans or provide guidance on it. We're not regulatory on them. We would just review them and see, we assess their effectiveness at getting people out of the floodplain. Our economic folks, our economists who have experience in emergency evacuation, at least analyzing traffic and things like that, they'll look at those, and that will be considered in the analysis.
Thanks, Eric. And Matt, we heard your reservation of rights. So if you want to follow up with the folks you mentioned, of course, feel free to do so. James, do we have any other public comments?
No other hands are currently raised.
Okay, well, unless that has changed, thank you very much. So we can wrap up today's meeting. Our next Citizen Advisory Committee meeting is planned for June. We're still confirming the date, but we will send out a calendar hold to commissioners and we'll update the website for the public as soon as possible. So please check the commission website for more meeting details. Thank you, everybody, for your participation today. We are adjourned, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.